set the scene for us.
Absolutely. And thank you, Kate, for your heart toward this and even to have the conversation. I've been involved in many conversations about this, and I love it every time because I think the more we keep talking about it,
Yes.
we're going to find out the great value and learn some pretty important lessons along the way. I agree. Yeah, there was the trickle of information being given. I think when we go back to the Emancipation Proclamation, I think a lot of people see that as this grand document that freed all slaves, and it didn't free all slaves.
Right.
Matter of fact, it was actually more of a kind of what I call an inciting of bringing people together around an ideal that there could be freedom of slavery. And the greatest aspect politically, which to this day we still see race being politicized, was that those that embraced that, well, now Black men could be a part of the Union Army and the Union Navy. And so that was a huge proponent of the Emancipation Proclamation, because now Black men who were feeling oppressed had an opportunity now to fight, quote unquote, for their freedom. So that was a large part of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so you're right, it didn't set all slaves free. And then we had the information being disseminated very slowly. And when General Granger shows up in Texas to now give this declaration that slaves are free, even then there were slaves that up to 6 years later, we have accounts from slaves who were interviewed 6 years later, they were still being beaten, they were still being treated as if slavery was alive and well. So even with the proclamation, slavery still didn't end, but at least it gave it a stamp in history. And yes, on June 19th, when that was declared, there were slaves that went into great joy, great celebration, and wanted to celebrate coming together to celebrate the holiday. And I think what's interesting is because of segregation, they didn't have a place to gather because they could not gather at the park. They could not gather at the formal social gathering spots. And so it was actually in around 1870 that a group of them got together, and they were called freed people. That was the moniker kind of given to slaves that were operating in their freedom, so to speak. They were called freed people, and they came together and came up with $800 and bought 10 acres of land right there in Houston area. And that 10 acres of land became Emancipation Park. And that's when technically Juneteenth was really celebrated, 1866. That following year is when they had the park now, and they opened it up. And actually that park was the only public place that many of them could even gather up until 1950. To me, that's staggering. That up to 1950, they could not gather anywhere other than that segregated space that they created for themselves. And so that's what's fascinating to me is it's not just Juneteenth, it's everything around it that brought that to be.
And so when you kind of pause and think about that was almost 100 years, right? That this, not only the celebration, but also that landmark exists, and it still exists today. And it was really this milestone for African-American people. And there's a lot of meaning to the way that it's celebrated. And I know that it's considered to be the longest running African-American holiday. And it holds 3 significant ideals to celebrate. Obviously, that's very important, but then to educate, and that's what we're hoping to do a little bit today, and then to agitate or to move the cause forward, right? And so when you think about those ideals, what does that bring to your mind and to your heart?
It brings to my heart and mind what should be the catalyst for all humans as it relates to moving forward in humanity, period. I don't think those ideals are specific to African Americans. I don't think they're specific to minorities. I think all of us should be looking at each one of us and saying, how can I celebrate you? How can I become more educated about you? And then how can we all agitate the system or the powers that be, or our own ignorance or our own pride? How can we agitate those things in us? I think when people hear the word agitation, they think instantly of something negative. But agitation has always been critical for anything to move forward. I mean, Jesus was one of the greatest agitators with everything that he did. And that's what's interesting to me is that Juneteenth keeps losing its significance until something is agitated that brings the awareness back. We go from 1865, and a lot of people didn't hear anything about Juneteenth when Jim Crow and that whole era took place in our country. It died down. And we don't see the resurgence of Juneteenth until we see the Poor People's Campaign and March in Washington in 1968. And so that campaign from May to June that Martin Luther King authored, but of course he was killed in April, but they decided to still do it. Well, that campaign, which lasted 6 weeks, 3,000 people, they built a whole town, a whole city called Resurrection City right there on the mall in Washington, and had their own zip code, for crying out loud. 2013 was the zip code. And so we see that whole movement, but actually what brought Juneteenth back to prominence was the agitation of what's called the Solidarity Day March that happened right on June 19th of that year of 1968, and 50 to 100,000 people were gathered there. And so that brought a resurgence of Juneteenth. So now Juneteenth is back and we're celebrating it, but then it loses again, it loses its luster and it's not really heard about. Now, what the beautiful part was with that many thousands of people, they went back to their prospective locations and said, oh my goodness, there's actually a holiday and there's a whole thing around this, and it began to spread. But again, it began to go down. And actually it wasn't to kind of some modern things that happened. When we go back to 2012, Trayvon Martin, when he was killed, 2013 was pivotal because George Zimmerman was found not guilty. Well, that happened around the same time as Juneteenth. Juneteenth comes with another surge, another agitation. Now we're celebrating Juneteenth. It dies down again. And then we have George Floyd. He's killed in May, right before Juneteenth. Now, all of a sudden, Juneteenth is being celebrated by thousands and millions of people, and it really has never been celebrated at the level that it has been after that happened with George Floyd. So this whole concept that they came up with, that agitation would be part of the awareness, has literally played out through history, that even the acknowledgement of this holiday took an agitation of some sort to even bring it back to preeminence. I think it's somewhat prophetic. And I think that it also speaks to us that something can live, and no matter what happens in history, if that thing is actually built on a solid foundation, it will continue to manifest over time. That's what I feel when I think of that.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. And as we continue to be educated, right, then those two components of education and agitation then become this really beautiful moving forward.
Okay. Yes.
I know there's some very traditional components of the celebration of Juneteenth, and obviously as things ebb and flow over time, those change, but I know some of them include public readings of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Absolutely.
Singing traditional songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. I think that was a song that I sang when I was a little girl at summer camp, right? And then reading public works by renowned African-American poets like Maya Angelou.
Yeah.
Do you have a specific memory of a celebration that you have been to?
And actually, I probably share in what many African Americans share in. I didn't celebrate Juneteenth growing up. Didn't know anything about Juneteenth. It was never talked about in school. I never heard of it in any history classes or books in my entire life. I grew up in Danville, Kentucky. And so Juneteenth for me has been a far later occurrence in my life of doing my own personal research and came upon it. And so for me, I spend most of my time with awareness of it, not necessarily celebrating it with things that I eat or do. I do it through education, being a part of panels, forums, and then I also try to do it through my graphic design. I always like to try to design something every year that really shows my passion for it. But then I share that with people and say, hey, you can have it for free, just post it and share it. And I plan to do that again this year. Did it last year, and it was a great success. A lot of people liked the design that I did and shared it. And that to me is how I celebrate it.
I love that. Yeah. So I think as Juneteenth, I think this is a really important, as Juneteenth begins to receive awareness, increased awareness, very much like what you were talking about in 2020, outside of the African-American community, with people who look like me. I think it's really important that we do that in a very mindful way. That's so much more than sharing a social media post on Juneteenth. And so some of the ways that I have done that, which is not enough, are supporting my area Black owned businesses. I think that's a great way to do that. speaking up when I hear or see racism in my community, in my areas of influence, and with the people that I know. I have the ability and the right to do that. What else? What are some other ideas that you have that would be a good idea?
Absolutely. Well, I think those two are outstanding. And the only thing that I would add to that is I'm more concerned with what happens June 18th and June 20th
Yes.
than I am June 19th. June 19th is going nowhere. But it's what happens the day before and the day after. And I say that kind of in a metaphorical way, but I think that we all have to take upon ourselves to say, if I'm truly going to celebrate the essence of a holiday and what it means, well, then it has to become a part of my lifestyle in some way. Otherwise, it's just a day that I did something out of feeling obligated or not to appear that I'm insensitive, which to me is disingenuous and it really doesn't accomplish anything. If anything, I would hope that people, if you take the time to study, you take the time to really look at what happened with June 19th and understand here are slaves who didn't even know they were free, who were still working at plantations, still thinking about how can I escape this reality and didn't know they were free. I think it makes all of us have to stop and think about how powerful education is. The difference was education. It wasn't money. The difference wasn't social standing per se. It was, I haven't been educated. And I think to this day, to me, that's the greatest pandemic we have, is lack of education. And I think that's the beauty of this. So if anything, get educated. Find forums, find seminars, find conferences online that you can attend. What you just said, I think, is beautiful. Yes, do business with Black-owned businesses. And I know that it gets tricky to say that, because I think sometimes people just want to say, hey, business is business. I'll do business with whoever. Why do we have to call it Black-owned? And why do we have to say minority-owned? And the issue that I realize people have with it, I do understand it. Trust me, I do understand it to some degree. But you have to understand, for so long, having a business as an African-American was something, first of all, that you couldn't even dream of. When actually you could do it, you were limited to what it could be. You were limited to the industries that it could be in. And so now this revival and resurgence that we can own any business we want and we can do whatever we want, well, it's more of a celebration. It's not Black people trying to be special, or I need you to acknowledge my business over someone else's. That is not the aspect. It's a celebration that I can have any business that I want. And I think when you become patrons of that business, you now are joining in celebration, not separation. You're joining in a celebration of this ideal that we are all equal. So I, as a white person, can walk into a Black establishment and patronize that business and spend my dollar there as celebration that you actually can have a business just like me, and it doesn't matter the color of your skin. That's how I wish America could see this. And I think if we saw it again, we're going back to Juneteenth, if we could see it as celebration, the celebration, I think, would make people want to get educated. And then we could all come together to agitate. I don't want just Black people coming together to agitate, because that's not going to work well for us. We need a concerted effort of everybody working together to agitate. And then we just create harmony and unity out of that. So yes, patronize businesses. I think also educate yourself and then talk to people who have knowledge about our history. Every Black person doesn't have knowledge about Black history. That's just a reality. So you may have a lot of Black friends. I get that all the time. Well, Pastor, I have a lot of Black friends. That's incredible. You should have friends of every race, as far as I'm concerned. But when it comes to education, every Black person can't educate you on our history, because many of them don't know the history. So it's being intentional. And that's the word I'd really like to use, is be intentional in your educational pursuits to find the answers that you want to have. And then no matter what history shows you, don't minimize or dismiss that it happened because it's ugly. And I think sometimes that's what gets lost when we start having conversations. It gets very uncomfortable to read certain reports of things that happen by white people doing things toward Black people. And my response to that is, I understand it's uncomfortable, but what about the people that were enduring it? What were they experiencing? It's uncomfortable for me to read, even though it didn't happen to me. And nobody in my generation inflicted that upon my ancestors. But even when I read those accounts, it's as if I can feel what they were feeling had happened. So I understand that it's hard to read certain accounts. It's very difficult to hear. We just dealt with the whole massacre at Tulsa and Black Wall Street. We just came through that. It's very difficult. And I get that. And I understand, hey, I just want to move forward because that's ugly. It's a dark stain on our history. And I get all of that, but we're doomed, as has been said so many times by many more popular and famous people than me, we're doomed to repeat the past if we don't learn those lessons from it. So I just say be intentional. I don't really have a list of what you do. I just say be intentional in understanding the plight of individuals who look differently than you, whether that's history. And unfortunately, you don't have to go to history. We can talk about some things presently that are very alarming for Black people. That might be where you start. If you don't want to go to history, well, then let's just start with present day. Many of the ills and social ills and struggles we're having, let's see what we can do to come up with solutions. That to me would be a greater appreciation of Juneteenth than a barbecue and festivities, which I love all of that, but I'm always trying to look at, okay, that's great, but what is a solution that we can come away with?
So I think those are some really important and key takeaways, whether you are an attender of a church, someone who's in a middle leadership position in a church, or if you are leading a church. I think those are, no matter where you are in that structure in a church, I think that's a key takeaway. My next question is, if you are someone in a church, at any level, who your church has not addressed anything close to Juneteenth to this point, so you are feeling a little hesitant to kind of put your toe in, which I understand, right? I understand. And I know you do too. Yes. What would you say, Pastor Larry, is kind of that good first way to kind of put your toe in? I'm not saying in a safe way, but in a very thoughtful way.
That's a great question, Kate. And I think a lot of people fall in that category. I choose to believe that so many people desire to see celebration of all races. They have a heart for minorities. They understand that, yes, there's been some serious issues with that in our country. So I choose to believe on the God side of people that, yes, I believe in equality. I think it's something we need to talk about. I think where a lot of people differ is the approach in which it's brought about. And that's been many of the conversations I've had when you talk about Black Lives Matter, or you talk about these movements and people not understanding the difference between the Black Lives Matter organization, which is a political organization, versus Black Lives Matter started as a thought, a concept. It wasn't connection to the organization. When I say Black Lives Matter, it has nothing to do with the organization. I pay no dues to that organization. I have no allegiance or alliance to that organization. But when I say that, it's an ideal. And of course, we know that all lives matter. That has never been a question, even among Black people. It's just that when we see a certain race having to deal with certain things perpetually and consistently that other races don't have to deal with, we have to stop and think about it. And again, it goes back to not that we're trying to separate, we're trying to educate. And so I think for churches, don't feel the pressure to become these institutions of social justice if you've never done that. Matter of fact, there's a fine line that you have to walk even when you're considering social justice as a part of your ministry. That has to be done very sagaciously, because sometimes we can mix the two and it doesn't do well for the cause of Jesus Christ. So I'm also aware of that. I would say to a church, if you want to, let's say this is the first opportunity that your church is going to take to celebrate a holiday that is geared toward a particular race. Here's what I would say to you. I would say to talk to your church about the Emancipation Proclamation. Talk to your church about what that ideal was, what that goal was. Connect that to the goal of Jesus Christ, is that we're all one with him. We're all the same with him. From there, talk about the beauty of what this brought about. Was it perfect? No. Did it accomplish everything it was sent out to do? No. Were all the motives behind it pure? Not at all. But that's the sovereignty of God. He has the ability to take things that may not have the best motives, but if God can use it, all things work together for good. He has the ability to make it good. So I think you can start there. I would connect the two. You don't have to leave it separate in history and not connect it to what we do with Christ. And I think this whole ideal of all men are created equal. We all have equal standing before Jesus Christ. Here's an opportunity, first time in our nation's history, that there's a proclamation from the government to that regard. And so out of that came this celebration for a group of people who didn't know they were free. And just talk about that aspect. Talk about the aspect of freedom to people that don't know they're free. That's the whole message of the gospel. If you just receive it, I think we can weave things together. And that's what I've seen to be very powerful when it comes to church. Weave the message of the gospel with history. And it makes it palpable for people who may be nervous about the implications of just celebrating the holiday. I would not recommend a church to do that. That's never done that. I do think, though, with creativity, we can weave those messages together. And guess what you're doing? You're celebrating and you're educating simultaneously. And you know what that's going to happen? Agitation is going to happen for people personally. Now, not necessarily they came from the pulpit. Now people in their personal time are going to go study Juneteenth because they heard about it first at their church. But it wasn't in an overt way. It wasn't in a way that would shock them. It wasn't in a way that would take them, kind of catch them off guard. You're doing it with wisdom. And that's what I would say. And if any church is struggling with that, please reach out to me. I promise you, I will help you. I won't charge you for consultation fees. Just reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help you kind of paint that narrative and even give script and to help whatever creative team that has to talk about this. It's that important to me. But I choose to believe that so many churches want to do it. They just don't quite know how to go about it.
I think that is absolutely beautiful, tying freedom, the freedom we have in Christ. I think that's just absolutely beautiful. So thank you for sharing about that.
Absolutely.
I have just one final thought that I thought we could flesh out a little bit. And that is, so if you are all in on everything we've talked about, so if you're like nodding and saying, yes, that's so good. I love this conversation. And you're looking for some resources. You're thinking, okay, but tell me what I can do next. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about some people you can follow on Insta or Facebook, some stuff you can watch on YouTube, maybe a book you can read, all the good stuff to kind of take it to the next level. So what would you recommend if you're in that camp, Pastor Larry?
Absolutely. I honestly, more than following people or really YouTube, and the only reason I say that is because I'm very cautious with my endorsements of people as it relates to social media. I encourage people to read. I encourage people to read because what I do know is that books that are written and well written, they're done so from a point of they have included their references. And there's more of a sense of that the information you're getting is accurate and it's not just based on conjecture or maybe an emotional tirade at a moment by someone.
Yes.
So a few books that I would recommend, The Birth of a White Nation by Jacqueline Badalora, great book. And maybe at some point I can send these to you, Katie. You can put it under this video or so forth. But and then The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander, great book. The reason that book is so important is seeing how there is still a structured and systematic plan in place, specifically as it relates to Black men for oppression. And that book will open your eyes to how this plays out with mass incarceration. I promise you, don't be thrown off by the title and think, oh, here we go again. Read that book because it will open your eyes. Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, a great text to read as well. And so I've got about 6 or 7 others, and I'll shoot them to you, and then you can disseminate that information too. But I would just say to anything that you see online, to anyone that you follow online, here's what this is my charge to you. Be diligent in your research of them. Everyone's motives are not pure. Some individuals' motive is to incite violence. It's to incite hatred, separatism. That is not what the majority of Black people in this country are about. We are about unity. We are about education. We do want to see celebration of who we are, but we never want to see that over celebration of anybody else. We just want it to be equal. That's all. We just want it to be equal. Not that we're better than or greater than. We just want it to be equal and be given credit for what we do, achieve, and make happen in this country. So that would be my recommendation. I hope I haven't let you down by not giving more sources, but I choose, when it comes to matters of this, I choose to go toward resources that I can actually prove. Where did you get the information? Where is this coming from? And literary pieces that are well written and well documented seem to serve best.
Mhm.